I knew something was terribly wrong when the ambulance stopped moving less than 200 feet from my house. At the time, I did not understand why it had stopped, and I definitely did not expect the answer to change my relationship with the entire neighborhood. My name is Jason Walker, and I had lived in Cedar Ridge Estates for nearly 8 years. It was the kind of subdivision where people waved from their driveways, complained about lawn height, and treated HOA meetings like major events. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, none of that mattered. My father, Robert Walker, was visiting for the weekend. We had spent most of the day working on a small project in my garage and talking about football. Everything felt completely normal until he suddenly told me he was not feeling well and needed to sit down. At first, I assumed he was tired. Then I noticed how uncomfortable he looked. I immediately helped him inside and called for emergency medical assistance. The dispatcher was calm and professional. She asked questions, confirmed my address, and assured me that help was on the way. I remember looking out the front window every few seconds, waiting for the vehicle to arrive. The minutes felt longer than they actually were. Then I finally heard it, the distant sound of an approaching siren. Relief washed over me. I stepped outside and looked toward the entrance of our subdivision. Several neighbors had already come outside after hearing the siren. Everything seemed to be happening exactly the way it should. Then the vehicle reached the main entrance road and unexpectedly stopped. At first, I thought it was slowing down to make a turn, but it did not continue. It remained in place. 10 seconds passed, then 20, then 30. I pulled out my phone and checked the route again. There was nothing blocking the road. No construcción, no accidente, no obvious reason for the delay. The vehicle was simply sitting there. I started walking quickly toward the entrance while keeping my phone nearby in case the dispatcher called back. As I got closer, I noticed several residents gathering near the front gate area. People were pointing and talking. Something was happening, but I could not tell what. Then I saw someone I immediately recognized. HOA President Melissa Grant was standing near the entrance, speaking to multiple people. Even from a distance, she appeared unusually animated. What struck me as strange was that she seemed completely focused on the situation despite having no reason to know what was happening inside my home. I continued moving toward the entrance. The closer I got, the more confused I became. The vehicle was still not proceeding. A small crowd had formed. Neighbors were pulling out phones. Others were standing in their driveways watching. The scene felt surreal. This was supposed to be a routine response to a call for help. Yet somehow, it had become a neighborhood spectacle. Then Melissa turned and looked directly at me. The expression on her face was not concern. It was frustration. Before I could even reach the group, she raised her voice and said something that made absolutely no sense. She told me I should have contacted the HOA first. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard her. But judging by the reactions around us, everyone else heard it too. For a few seconds, I just stood there trying to process what Melissa had said. Contact the HOA first? My father was inside my house waiting for medical assistance, and the HOA president was talking about neighborhood procedures. The entire situation felt disconnected from reality. Several residents looked just as confused as I was. Others simply watched without saying anything. I asked Melissa what she meant. Instead of answering directly, she launched into a speech about community access policies, coordination procedures, and the importance of following established channels. None of it explained why the vehicle was still sitting near the entrance. While she spoke, I noticed something else. The driver appeared to be waiting for instructions. Every second felt longer than the last. I immediately called the dispatcher again. When she answered, I explained that the vehicle had stopped near the entrance and asked whether there was a problem. The dispatcher sounded surprised. She placed me on hold briefly, then returned and said the crew was attempting to confirm access information. That response only made me more confused. Cedar Ridge Estates was not a restricted community. Emergency vehicles entered regularly whenever necessary. There was no special process. No unusual requirement. Nothing that should have caused this kind of delay. Moments later, the situation finally started moving again. The vehicle continued down the street and arrived at my house. I hurried back home, relieved that help had finally reached us. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of concern and uncertainty. Thankfully, my father's condition stabilized, and later that evening I was finally able to sit down and think about everything that had happened. The more I replayed the events in my head, the less sense they made. Why had Melissa been at the entrance so quickly? Why did she seem to know details about the situation? And why had she immediately framed the issue as a violation of HOA procedures rather than expressing concern for my father? I did not have answers. Unfortunately, things became even stranger the following day. By noon, rumors were already circulating throughout the neighborhood. Several residents asked why I had created confusion at the entrance. One neighbor claimed I had caused a disagreement with emergency personnel. Another said the delay occurred because I failed to provide proper information. Every version sounded different, yet they all pointed toward the same conclusion. Somehow, I was being blamed. The speed of a narrative shocked me. Less than 24 hours had passed, and people were already repeating stories that did not match what I personally experienced. Then came the biggest surprise. That afternoon, the HOA distributed a community email. The message discussed the importance of following neighborhood communication procedures during urgent situations. It warned against actions that could allegedly create unnecessary complications for responders. My name never appeared in the email, but did not need to. Everyone knew exactly who it was about. As I read the message, my frustration turned into suspicion. The wording was careful. The accusations were indirect, but the implication was obvious. Before anyone had examined what actually happened, a version of events was already being established. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the email, while my father rested in the next room. The original concern should have been simple. Yet somehow the conversation had shifted completely away from what occurred and toward assigning blame. And the person directing that conversation seemed to be the same person who appeared at the entrance before anyone else even understood there was a problem. Over the next week, I learned how quickly a neighborhood can accept a story when it is repeated often enough. Everywhere I went, people seemed to have an opinion about what happened, even though very few had actually witnessed the entire situation. The strange part was how similar the rumors sounded. Different neighbors used different words, but the message remained the same. According to the version spreading through Cedar Ridge estates, I had somehow complicated an already difficult situation. Some people claimed I had failed to provide information. Others suggested I became argumentative at the entrance. A few even implied that the delay occurred because of my own actions. None of those claims matched reality, yet they moved through the neighborhood with remarkable speed. What frustrated me most was that almost nobody asked for my side of the story. They simply accepted the version already circulating. A few days later, I noticed the change becoming more personal. Residents who normally stopped to chat now offered quick greetings before walking away. Conversations became shorter. Invitations disappeared. Nothing dramatic happened, but the atmosphere shifted enough that I could feel it. I was no longer just Jason Walker, the neighbor who had lived there for years. I had become the subject of a community controversy. Then the HOA announced a special meeting. Officially, the gathering was intended to discuss communication procedures and community coordination. Unofficially, everyone knew why people would attend. The clubhouse was packed. Residents filled nearly every chair. Some stood against the walls. Melissa sat at the front beside several board members with a stack of documents arranged neatly on the table. She looked completely confident. That confidence immediately put me on edge. The meeting began with routine topics before eventually moving toward the issue everyone expected. Melissa spoke at length about the importance of order, cooperation, and proper channels during urgent situations. At first, her comments sounded general. Then they became increasingly specific. Without mentioning my name, she described an incident that had allegedly created confusion and unnecessary complications. Heads slowly turned toward me. I remained quiet and listened. The more she spoke, the clearer her strategy became. She was not presenting evidence. She was shaping perception. Then she introduced something new. According to Melissa, several residents had expressed concern regarding how the situation had been handled. She referenced written comments and feedback collected after the incident. What struck me was that nobody questioned where those opinions originated or whether the people providing them had full information. The assumption seemed to be that volume alone created credibility. After the meeting ended, I approached one of the board members I had known for years. His reaction surprised me. Instead of defending the presentation, he appeared uncomfortable. When I asked whether he genuinely believed the story being told, he hesitated before answering. Then he quietly said something that stayed with me. He said, "Most people already made up their minds before this meeting started." That sentence explained everything. The gathering was never intended to investigate what happened. It was designed to reinforce a conclusion that already existed. As I walked back to my car, I noticed several residents standing in small groups discussing the meeting. Most repeated the same talking points they had heard inside, yet a few seemed uncertain. For the first time, I overheard people questioning specific details instead of accepting them automatically. It was only a small shift, but it mattered. Because the more people examined the timeline, the harder it became to ignore one simple fact. The story everyone believed still did not explain why the vehicle stopped in the first place. The first real crack in the story appeared when I stopped looking at opinions and started looking at time. Up until that point, most conversations in Cedar Ridge estates focused on blame. People argued about behavior, procedures, and assumptions. Almost nobody talked about the timeline itself. Once I started examining it, things became much harder to ignore. I sat down one evening and wrote out everything I remembered from that afternoon. The call, the arrival of neighbors, the vehicle stopping near the entrance, Melissa appearing almost immediately, the HOA email the next day. As I arranged events in order, one question kept bothering me. How did Melissa seem so prepared before most residents even knew what was happening? The more I thought about it, the stranger it felt. A few days later, another detail surfaced unexpectedly. I was speaking with a neighbor named Karen Lewis, a retired school administrator who usually avoided neighborhood drama. During our conversation, she mentioned something she had noticed on the day of the incident. According to her, Melissa appeared to know exactly where to go when she arrived at the entrance. Karen found that unusual because information had not spread widely yet. At the time, she dismissed it as coincidence. Looking back, she was not so sure. That comment stayed with me. It did not prove anything, but it matched the pattern I had been noticing. Then another strange piece appeared. While reviewing the HOA email again, I realized it referenced concerns about community coordination almost immediately after the event occurred. The language made it sound as though conclusions had already been reached. Yet no formal review had taken place. No one had interviewed me. No public discussion had occurred. Somehow the narrative existed before any investigation. The timeline simply did not fit. The following weekend, I attended a neighborhood barbecue hosted by a family a few streets away. Normally, these gatherings were relaxed. This one felt different. The controversy had become impossible to avoid. During several conversations, residents repeated details about the incident with complete confidence. What caught my attention was that some of those details contradicted one another. One person claimed the delay lasted only seconds. Another insisted it lasted several minutes. One neighbor believed emergency personnel were confused by directions. Another claimed there was a disagreement at the entrance. Everyone seemed certain, yet nobody agreed on the facts. The contradictions were becoming impossible to miss. Then something happened that shifted my thinking again. A resident named Mark Henderson approached me privately near the end of the event. He told me he had been walking his dog near the entrance shortly before everything happened. According to Mark, multiple people on the street had their phones out during the incident. At first, I assumed he meant they were simply watching. Then he clarified. He remembered seeing residents recording because unusual activity at the entrance had drawn attention. The statement caught me completely off guard. Recording. The word immediately stuck in my mind. I asked whether he knew who had recorded anything. He did not. He simply remembered seeing several people holding phones. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but it created a completely new possibility. Until then, I had focused on meetings, emails, and rumors. Now I was considering something different. If residents had recorded portions of what happened, then objective evidence might exist somewhere. More importantly, that evidence would not depend on anyone's version of events. As I drove home that night, one thought kept returning. The story being told throughout Cedar Ridge Estates depended entirely on people accepting someone else's explanation. But explanations become much weaker when recordings exist. The next HOA meeting felt less like a discussion and more like an attempt to close the case permanently. The notice sent to residents described it as an opportunity to address remaining questions and move forward as a community. That wording immediately caught my attention because most of the important questions had never actually been answered. Yet somehow the neighborhood was already being encouraged to move on. When the evening arrived, the clubhouse was packed again. The atmosphere felt different from previous meetings. Residents were still interested, but there was also a sense that many expected a final conclusion. Melissa stood at the front beside several board members with the same confidence she had displayed from the beginning. If anything, she seemed more determined than ever. The meeting opened with routine HOA business before eventually shifting toward the controversy everyone came to discuss. Melissa spoke about community unity, responsible communication, and the importance of preventing unnecessary conflict. Then she carefully returned to the incident. Once again, she never mentioned my name directly. She did not need to. Everyone understood exactly who she was referring to. What surprised me was how structured the presentation felt. It was almost as if every question had already been anticipated. Melissa referenced community feedback, resident concerns, and lessons learned. The message was clear. The matter had been examined, conclusions had been reached, and it was time to stop talking about it. For a moment, it seemed like the strategy might work. Several residents nodded in agreement. Others appeared ready to move on. Then something unexpected happened. A homeowner named Rachel Bennett raised her hand. Rachel was not known for challenging anyone. In fact, she rarely spoke during meetings at all. That was why the room immediately became quiet. Her question sounded simple. She wanted to know why nobody had explained the actual reason the vehicle stopped at the entrance. The effect was immediate. Melissa answered by referring to coordination concerns and communication issues. Rachel listened carefully and then asked a second question. If that explanation was accurate, why did different residents describe different causes for the delay? This time the room grew noticeably quieter. Several people exchanged glances. I could see residents mentally comparing the stories they had heard over the previous weeks. The contradictions were no longer hidden. Melissa attempted to redirect the discussion toward community procedures, but the momentum had shifted. Another homeowner asked about the timeline. Someone else questioned why conclusions seemed to appear before facts were gathered. For the first time, the conversation was moving in a direction Melissa did not appear to control. The meeting eventually ended without providing the clear resolution many expected. Instead, it created even more uncertainty. As residents gathered outside afterward, conversations continued throughout the parking lot. People were discussing inconsistencies rather than repeating talking points. They were asking questions instead of accepting answers. Then a conversation near my car caught my attention. Two neighbors were discussing how many people had been outside when the incident occurred. One of them casually mentioned that nearly every house on the street seemed to have cameras or doorbell systems these days. The comment was brief, and neither person treated it as important. But I immediately did. Cameras. The word hit me differently now than it would have a few weeks earlier. Mark had mentioned residents recording on their phones. Now I was hearing about doorbell cameras throughout the neighborhood. Suddenly, a possibility began forming in my mind. What if the incident had been captured from multiple angles without anyone realizing it? As I drove home, I could not stop thinking about that idea. Because if enough devices were recording that afternoon, then somewhere in Cedar Ridge Estates, there might be a version of events that did not depend on memory, rumors, or HOA meetings. Once the possibility of recordings entered my mind, I started noticing details that I had completely overlooked before. Cedar Ridge Estates was the kind of neighborhood where technology quietly blended into everyday life. Doorbell cameras sat beside front doors. Security cameras overlooked driveways. Homeowners recorded package deliveries, wildlife, weather events, and sometimes nothing at all. Yet on the afternoon, everything happened, Nearly the entire street had been outside, watching an unusual situation unfold. The more I thought about it, the more likely it seemed that at least some of it had been captured. I began speaking with neighbors, casually rather than presenting it as an investigation. Most conversations led nowhere. Some residents no longer had recordings from that day. Others never checked their systems. A few simply wanted the controversy behind them. Then something unexpected happened. A neighbor named Brian Foster mentioned that he remembered reviewing his doorbell footage after hearing rumors about the incident. According to Brian, the video showed people gathering near the entrance far earlier than he expected. He no longer had the clip because his system automatically deleted older recordings, but his observation immediately caught my attention. It matched a pattern I kept seeing. Awareness of the situation appeared to spread much faster than the public timeline suggested. Around the same time, neighborhood discussions continued evolving. More residents were asking questions. Some wanted to know why no clear explanation for the delay had ever been provided. Others were becoming frustrated by conflicting stories. The confidence that once surrounded Melissa's narrative was beginning to weaken. Every conversation seemed to create new doubts instead of new certainty. Then another unexpected detail surfaced. During a casual discussion outside the community mailbox area, a resident named Ellen Carter mentioned something she found strange. She recalled seeing multiple neighbors holding up phones and recording during the incident because the stopped vehicle had attracted attention. What surprised her was not the recording itself. It was how many people were doing it. The comment stopped me cold. Up until then, I assumed there might be one or two useful recordings somewhere. Ellen's observation suggested something much bigger. If numerous residents recorded the same event from different locations, then the neighborhood may have captured a complete timeline without realizing it. That possibility changed everything. A few days later, another development pushed the story in an entirely new direction. During a board discussion, one resident asked whether any community cameras existed near the entrance road. The question seemed innocent enough, but the reaction in the room immediately stood out. Several board members exchanged quick glances before answering. Eventually, someone confirmed that common area cameras monitored portions of the entrance corridor for property security purposes. The room became noticeably quieter. Until that moment, many residents had not even known those systems existed. Suddenly, people were asking follow-up questions. Were the cameras operating that day? How long were recordings stored? Had anyone reviewed them? The answers were vague. Too vague. Melissa quickly redirected the discussion toward unrelated HOA business, but the damage was already done. Residents were no longer focused solely on opinions or rumors. They were focused on evidence. As the meeting ended, conversations erupted throughout the parking lot. For the first time since this began, people seemed genuinely interested in what could be verified rather than what could be repeated. Driving home that night, I realized something important. The neighborhood had spent weeks arguing over different versions of events. Yet if enough recordings existed, the truth might already be sitting across dozens of devices throughout Cedar Ridge Estates. Nobody knew exactly what those recordings showed, but one thing was becoming increasingly clear. If the footage ever surfaced, it could change everything. The turning point arrived when people stopped asking whether recordings existed and started asking how many existed. That difference changed the entire atmosphere inside Cedar Ridge Estates. For weeks, the controversy had depended on competing stories. Residents repeated what they heard, challenged one another's memories, and argued over details that nobody could fully verify. Now, the conversation was shifting towards something far more concrete. The first sign appeared during a neighborhood gathering outside the clubhouse. A small group of residents began comparing what they remembered from the afternoon of the incident. What surprised everyone was how many people independently mentioned recording at least part of what happened. Some used phones. Others relied on doorbell cameras. A few remembered reviewing security footage afterward because unusual activity near the entrance had triggered notifications. None of them claimed to possess a complete picture, but together they revealed something important. The event had been observed from far more angles than anyone originally realized. Word spread quickly. Within days, conversations throughout the neighborhood focused almost entirely on recordings. People were no longer debating whether witnesses existed. They were realizing the entire street may have become a witness. That realization seemed to unsettle some members of HOA leadership. During one discussion, a resident casually asked whether community camera footage had ever been compared with homeowner recordings. The question received a vague response, but the reaction around the room spoke louder than the answer. Several board members appeared uncomfortable. Melissa immediately redirected attention toward procedural topics. Yet the more she tried to move the conversation away from recordings, the more interested residents became. Then an unexpected development changed everything again. A homeowner named Daniel Reeves attended a meeting and shared an observation that instantly captured the room's attention. Daniel worked in information technology and had spent time helping neighbors recover archived files in the past. During a conversation about the controversy, he realized something most residents overlooked. Many modern systems automatically synchronize footage to cloud storage rather than deleting everything permanently. The statement triggered an immediate reaction. Homeowners who believed recordings were gone suddenly started reconsidering. Several people mentioned checking old backups. Others promised to review archived accounts. What began as curiosity quickly transformed into a neighborhood-wide search. The atmosphere shifted dramatically over the next week. Residents who had never spoken about the incident began comparing timestamps and camera locations. People mapped out sightlines from driveways, front porches, and entrance roads. The emerging picture suggested something remarkable. Even if no single recording captured everything, dozens of devices may have documented different pieces of the same timeline. Then came another surprise. During a community discussion, one homeowner mentioned finding a short archive clip showing activity near the entrance at a time that did not align with the narrative most residents had heard. The clip itself was not publicly shared yet, but the existence of even one recovered recording immediately increased interest throughout the neighborhood. Questions multiplied overnight. If one recording survived, how many others existed? As momentum continued building, something else became impossible to ignore. Melissa no longer seemed eager to discuss the matter publicly. The confidence that once defined her responses had started fading. Instead of offering direct explanations, she increasingly relied on general statements about moving forward and preserving community harmony. Residents noticed. The more they noticed, the more suspicious they became. By the end of the week, Cedar Ridge Estates was no longer divided over competing stories. It was waiting for evidence. And for the first time since this ordeal began, I had the feeling that the answer was not hidden inside a meeting, an email, or a rumor. It was hidden inside recordings that nobody expected would matter until it was too late. The moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived during a special community meeting scheduled less than 2 weeks later. By then, the search for recordings had spread throughout Cedar Ridge Estates. Residents compared archived files, reviewed old notifications, and examined footage from every possible angle. Nobody knew exactly what had been recovered, but rumors were everywhere. The clubhouse reached standing room capacity before the meeting even began. Homeowners filled every seat and lined the walls. The atmosphere felt completely different from previous gatherings. People were no longer interested in speculation. They wanted answers. As the meeting started, Melissa attempted to focus on routine HOA business. The effort lasted only a few minutes before residents began asking about the recordings. Questions came from every direction. Had footage been reviewed? Were the timelines being compared? What had actually been found? Eventually, one of the board members stood and announced that multiple recordings from homeowners and community cameras had been collected and organized into a single timeline. The room immediately fell silent. Every conversation stopped. For weeks, residents had argued about memories and interpretations. Now, they were about to see evidence. A large screen at the front of the room displayed the first clip, then another, then another. The footage came from different houses, different angles, and different devices. Individually, each recording seemed ordinary. Together, they created something much more powerful. They created a complete sequence of events. As the timeline unfolded, several things became clear immediately. Residents could see exactly when neighbors began gathering near the entrance. They could see when vehicles arrived. They could see when conversations occurred. Most importantly, they could see the timing. And the timing did not match the version of events that had dominated the neighborhood for weeks. Audible reactions spread across the room. People started exchanging looks. Some quietly shook their heads. Others leaned forward to examine details more closely. Then came the portion that changed everything. The combined recordings showed the period when the vehicle stopped near the entrance and documented interactions occurring around that moment from multiple perspectives. Nothing dramatic appeared on screen. The power of the footage came from something much simpler. It removed uncertainty. Residents no longer needed to rely on assumptions because they could see the sequence for themselves. Every clip reinforced the same timeline. Every angle supported the same conclusion. As additional footage played, contradictions that once seemed minor became impossible to ignore. Statements repeated during meetings no longer aligned with the visual record. Explanations that had sounded convincing suddenly appeared incomplete. The room grew quieter with each passing minute. Melissa remained seated near the front, but for the first time since this began, she was no longer directing the conversation. The recordings were doing that. When the final clip ended, silence filled the clubhouse. Then questions erupted from every direction. Residents wanted to know why key details had never been discussed. They wanted to understand how certain conclusions became accepted so quickly. Most importantly, they wanted to know why the narrative focused so heavily on me when the footage showed a very different progression of events. Several board members appeared stunned by the reaction. Others simply avoided speaking. The evidence had changed the dynamic completely. For weeks, the controversy revolved around competing stories. In less than 30 minutes, those stories lost their power. The recordings had created something stronger than opinion. They created a shared reality that everyone in the room could see at the same time. And as I looked around the clubhouse that evening, one thing became obvious. The neighborhood was not questioning me anymore. It was questioning everything it had been told. The aftermath moved faster than anything that came before it. For weeks, Cedar Ridge estates had been divided by rumors, assumptions, and competing versions of the same event. After the recordings were shown, that division disappeared almost overnight. The reason was simple. People no longer needed to choose which story they believed. They had already seen the timeline for themselves. The days following the meeting were filled with conversations unlike any I had experienced since moving into the neighborhood. Residents who had once avoided me now approached to ask questions. Others admitted they had accepted early explanations without examining the facts. Several homeowners apologized for assuming the worst. I appreciated those conversations, but what stood out most was how often people said the same thing. They were not angry because mistakes happened. They were angry because they felt they had been guided toward conclusions before the full picture was available. The pressure on HOA leadership increased immediately. Residents began requesting records, meeting notes, and explanations regarding how information had been communicated throughout the controversy. Discussions that once ended quickly now lasted for hours. Homeowners demanded transparency. They wanted clear answers rather than carefully worded summaries. The atmosphere inside community meetings changed completely. Questions that would have been dismissed a month earlier now received serious attention. Melissa continued attending meetings, but the confidence that once defined her public appearances was gone. Every statement was examined carefully. Every explanation generated follow-up questions. The authority she had relied upon for months no longer carried the same weight. Residents wanted evidence. More importantly, they now understood the difference between evidence and assumptions. As those discussions continued, something else happened. The original issue that started everything finally received proper attention. Community procedures regarding emergency access were reviewed. Communication policies were updated. Several recommendations were adopted to ensure future situations would be handled more effectively. Ironically, The concern that had been overshadowed by controversy became the one issue everyone agreed needed improvement. Looking back, that outcome mattered more than anything else. My goal was never to become involved in a neighborhood conflict. I never wanted to spend months defending myself against rumors. I simply wanted help to reach my father without unnecessary complications. Thankfully, my father recovered well and often joked that he caused more HOA meetings during one visit than most residents caused in a decade. His humor helped me appreciate how far things had come. Yet the experience left a lasting impression on the community. People became more cautious about accepting information without verification. They asked more questions. They paid closer attention to timelines and evidence. In many ways, Cedar Ridge Estates became a different neighborhood because of what happened. The most revealing moment came several months later during a routine community gathering. A resident stood and thanked homeowners who contributed recordings during the review process. The room responded with applause. Not because people enjoyed the controversy, not because anyone wanted conflict. The applause came from recognizing that ordinary residents had preserved the truth without realizing it. None of them set out to become witnesses. They simply happened to document what they saw. Whenever I think about the entire ordeal now, one lesson stands above everything else. A narrative can spread quickly when only a few voices control the conversation. But when an entire community unknowingly records the same event from dozens of perspectives, the truth becomes much harder to bury. In the end, it was not an argument, a meeting, or a rumor that changed people's minds. It was the moment everyone saw the same evidence at the same time. And once that happened, the story no longer belonged to the loudest person in the room. It belonged to the facts.